Thanks so much, Uma. And thank you also to Rob and Shamel. I forget who did what and when, but I was delighted to receive the invitation because it's been a long, long time since I've traveled outside of London, which probably says a lot about me and London. But one of the places that I really enjoy going to is Manchester. So in a way, I'm conflicted about not being able to be there in person. I want to start the paper or the presentation with a vignette, and the vignette is one of the Atlantic slave trade, where at its height in the 18th century, the slave ship contained multiple temporalities that we are wanting to explore in the next 30, 40 minutes. Enslaved Africans, as we know, faced a lifetime of legal bondage and servitude, which could really only end through death or escape or emancipation. But in that very same slave ship, which many scholars, from Marcus Rediker to right through to Paul Gilroy, who will appear in a different way, guys have invoked, in that very same ship, the first free-waged industrial workers, the seamen tasked with transporting these bond peoples across the Middle Passage, were paid a cash sum for their seafaring labor, which, despite the ruthlessness and the onboard hierarchies and indeed the on landside coercion to service, could terminate at the end of each voyage. So already there we've got the contrast between lifetime and bonds peoples and free wage laborers and the termination of contracts, or at least the renewing of contracts. And coordinating, disciplining, exchanging, exploiting these human bodies and the potential labor was a third conception of time. If the first one was a lifetime, and the second is about wage or labor time, the third time is that of merchant capital, where the ledger sheet or the insurance policy, the interest rate are all measured, calculated, and managed for the profit accrued from this human trafficking. And it's that simultaneous presence in the slave ship, in the transatlantic slave trade, of those three temporalities that will act as an opening for what we hope is going to be an illustration more than an in-depth analysis of how the social form we call capitalism interacts with the natural forces of the sea, which Leon and I developed in the book, suggests it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a very lovely word, potentially a terraqueous territoriality, which we want to then take in a perhaps more temporal guise today. So we're going to, in a very stylized form, try and organize our thoughts around three conceptions of time: the deep time of nature, which Liam will speak about in just a minute, the surface time of capitalist transactions and exchange, and the lifetime of those that labor or have been transported through the seas.
Yeah, sorry about that. It took a while to find unmute. Thanks for the introduction, Alex. What we wanted to do today was take a little bit of a step back from the book and think a little bit about the maritime temporalities that are embedded in the book, but we haven't kind of drawn out in one place. So this is work in progress, so do forgive us. But we wanted to start off with deep time because when we think about the Holocene, the period of relative stability of human civilization over the last 12,000 years, very often we are thinking about the atmosphere and we're thinking about the biosphere, but much less often, or at least in kind of the public domain, are we thinking about the hydrosphere, or especially the global ocean. And for many, the ocean is a forgotten space, not only in terms of kind of capitalist relations of exchange, which we'll come to in a bit, but also when we think about the deep time of the Earth system. And instead, when we think about problems with the ocean, we'll be thinking about plastics pollution, microplastics, we'll be thinking about fisheries, and so on. But one of the things that we miss in this story is the climate change's evil twin, which is ocean acidification. And I think that what this allows us to see is very much the externalities, if you like, or the hidden costs of our capitalist civilization. So around 50% of all of the carbon dioxide that we've produced under capitalism, under industrial capitalism, has been absorbed in the ocean. And so what that means is that the pH balance has been altered, creating a greater level of ocean acidification, which is 26% more acidic than it was in the 1750s. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, if we take this long geological kind of understanding of historical time that we started out with, and kind of showing kind of global temperature, pre-civilizational global temperature, if you adopt a similar approach to looking at ocean acidification, current levels of ocean acidification are unique in the last 2 million years. And so already you can start to see some of the major problems that we are baking into the system as a result of our activities, which are well known to everybody here. But why does this matter? Well, it matters because of ocean critters, most importantly phytoplankton, but also other small critters like that have shells or skeletons, which cannot be formed with greater levels of acidity in the ocean. And contrary to much popular understanding of oceanic biomass or life in the seas, 90% of oceanic biomass is not fish. It's these tiny little critters, phytoplankton and so on, which are the basis of the entire food web and thereby the entire ecosystem that the ocean provides. There's another layer to this that we perhaps miss when we think about the ocean and when we think about climate change, and that's the way that the ocean acts as a fundamental heat sink. Around 90% of all of Earth's excess energy since the 1950s has been absorbed by the global ocean. So of all of the heat taken in by the ocean between 1865 and 2015, half of that happened since the mid-1990s. So when I came to Manchester to do my degree, my first degree in 1996, since then, in that not even a lifetime, half of the oceanic heat that currently exists in the ocean was absorbed. Now, as we already also know, the sea is already biting back. And so I think a useful image here, taken from a great book called Atlas of the Invisible, highly recommended. And what they are trying to do is to show the world in kind of unusual ways. And what's really striking here, and I think is very often missed when we think about the oceans, is the fact that it's a single global ocean. And one of the things they're showing here is the way that the ocean is already kind of biting back, so to speak, or the climate is already biting back with a significant increase in tropical cyclones, their incidence, and so on. And so from there, I'll pass back to Alex to kind of historicize this a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're trying to grapple with these big structures, massive processes, and even bigger comparisons is trying to think about how these different temporalities overlap. So one of the critical issues is, when did capitalism start? You'll be glad to know that we don't have a fixed answer, or at least not a definitive answer, and not one that we're going to elaborate at great length here. But the issue here is around the ways in which the conventional understanding of capitalism emerging in the long 16th century is, in our story, very much about grafting onto existing institutional forms that were often carried through the sea, in the Indian Ocean, in parts of the Pacific Ocean. So many of the features of modern contemporary or even mercantile capitalism, like free wage labor, like the presence of arbitrage, the existence of shareholding companies that are seafaring, the risk management thereof, do have long antecedents before the rise of merchant capitalism in the long 16th century. And Jairus Banerjee, for instance, has, I think, made quite compelling case for this being so. So there is an issue here about periodization. If capitalism is not merely about conveyance, buying cheap and selling dear, and it's not simply a question of long distance seaborne trade, of which there have been many instances in the past, then what is distinctive about it? And from our account, and here we adopted perhaps a more conventional or more orthodox Marxian perspective, it is about value creation in an integrated system, or the integration of distinct sectors of the economy, many of them seafaring, in those hubs like Antwerp and subsequently Amsterdam and London. So the integration of, if you like, in conventional Marxist accounts, of money capital, of productive capital, in all its circulation. Now, we try and reconcile, therefore, the circulationist understanding of capitalism as mainly being about the accumulation of wealth through long distance trade, of which patently is the case, with this recognition that something quite distinctive happens in the around the English Channel, in the North Sea, in the course of the long 16th century, which then crystallizes that circuit of capital, as I was saying, connecting the money and the productive expressions of capital. Now, this is important because I think it then makes us, from a 21st century perspective, have to think about conjunctures and about the longue durée and the way in which nature itself incorporates itself into that calculation in the book, but also hopefully developing from this, we pick up the wonderful emergence of seafaring histories of the past 2 or 3 decades, focusing, I mean, from the classics by Chowdhury in the 1980s through more recent work by, well, my erstwhile colleague at Birkbeck and new authors like Sujit Sivasundaram, his new book on the waves around the South, is this incorporation of phenomena like the monsoon, or like Liam was talking about the hydrological systems that characterize that particular ocean, and how they inserted themselves into the circuits of capital accumulation and expansion from the beginning of that long 16th century. And so we've got figures that are very important to our story, and indeed the history generally, universal history, like seafarers of the Indian Ocean, the so-called Lascars, semi-indentured seafarers, who were the muscles of empire, and therefore have to be factored into any analysis of how the innovations, but also, and this is critical for us, the continuities in seafaring form. So this is a long way of saying that one of the areas of where I think the sea can tell us a lot about time, or their specific maritime temporalities, is periodization. How does one conceive of the Lascar as a worker? Is he, and he was overwhelmingly he, pre-modern, pre-colonial? Clearly there are elements of that, but in some respects, the figure of the Lascar is racialized and codified, legalized, very much as a modern, pretty much an industrial worker of European imperialism. So those are the kinds of temporalities that, again, really come to the fore in looking at the development of capitalism through the ship that I was referring to just a minute ago. And I think this then allows, hopefully, Liam to pick up now on how the deep time that we've been exploring, excuse the punnery here, but emerges onto the surface as surface time, which Liam will talk about briefly now.
Yeah, and so this the second notion of time we were kind of playing around with is the notion of surface time, and the idea is to counterpoint it with this deep times, a deep geological time and deep historical time from a kind of sense of human history. to point out two things really. First of all, we see the way that what Capital views the sea as very much a surface level understanding of the importance of the sea to the civilization of Capital, or the empire of Capital. But also how as a species we have a very strong kind of tendency to presentism, and we hope in the book and in the presentation to try and move beyond that presentism. Because equally we could have used concepts such as circulation time, which are, of course are very embedded in political economy. But we wanted to move beyond that or away from that for two reasons. I mean, I should just reiterate, first of all, circulation time can be used in multiple ways. First and foremost, or most descriptively, as a commodity movement. So the oceans there are central to the movement of goods in complex global production networks, which everyone's aware of. But also in the second sense, and that's the sense of the empire of capital and the circulation of capital. And again, the seaward-facing societies of most capitalist economies have been centrally embedded in these kind of circuits or circulations of capital. And so we prefer surface time as we want to get away from emphases that perhaps embed political economy predispositions and try and play a little bit around more fully or more perhaps playfully with the distinction with kind of deep time. In other words, we don't want to be capital centric. And so what we did also was, in the book, place a significant emphasis on trying to downplay a lot of the arguments in maritime logistics that focus on speed up. So when we think about maritime logistics and when we read about maritime logistics, one of the key concerns that's emphasized is faster turnover time. And of course, that is central to capital as a whole. But what we see in the study of maritime logistics itself as an industry, and not as an abstraction, as a concrete form, we see that actually ships regularly slow steam. They very explicitly try to reduce their costs of operation by burning less bunker fuel, because the speed matters less than the planning. And for us, what we see in the system of kind of surface time, at least from the perspective of capital, just to kind of show the image, hopefully that's projecting here, is this kind of complex kind of system that everyone knows about very well, but what we're focusing here on is the shipping lanes, and what we think matters most to an understanding of surface time, and in this case ships plying the surface of the global ocean, is the regularity and reliability of ocean-going sea freight. So that allows for the fragmentation of global production, which again, this is something that's going to be well understood in the Global Development Institute, the global production networks that allow for the current kind of system of both global and regional fragmentation of production. And we think that maritime logistics, intrinsic to maritime logistics, is actually capitalist planning. And we want to try and challenge those who are focusing primarily on speed up through this argument. So what's also, I think, interesting here, and then kind of connecting this notion of surface time back to the deep historical time, is the remarkable stability from the perspective of capital, at least, of the kind of key center points of the global economy, as Alex was pointing out earlier, and he might want to elaborate more on this again in a moment, but the legacy of colonialism and imperialism is very much embedded in this kind of system of sea lanes. And that, again, even in the era of steam, was primarily, we argue in the book, and we want to kind of insist on really now, is a process of capitalist planning of the global economy, and not necessarily a simplistic or a capital-centric kind of view of speed up. Did you want to add anything to that, Alex?
No, that's fine. I think we'll probably pick up or maybe pick up in the Q&A on this.
Thanks. And so the third type of time that we wanted to emphasize is lifetime. And here we're playing with a variety, a number of different notions of lifetime. But to start off with, from the perspective of capital, this is primarily about labor time, the operational costs and profits of shifting stuff, moving stuff around the sea. And then through this lens, we see ever bigger boats carrying more cargo per crew. So a very basic indicator of kind of labor productivity. And we do see, I mean, to kind of contradict the argument that I was making earlier, we do see significant speed up of turnaround time in ports. But one of the other things that we want to emphasize into thinking about lifetime is the quite different the shifts in kind of working conditions at sea. And so there are a number of similarities, I think, that face crew in early steamships. You can see the crew of the Corridor here. You can see crew of an unnamed boat, but taken by a crew member, which I found, both of which are images that show the kind of relative degree of solidarity of the crew, this kind of sense of togetherness. But most literature that we read or that we see on life at sea and talking to organizers and seafarers, life at sea is a process of highly alienated labor. It's extremely dull. There is quite different levels of risk depending upon where one works. So if you're in the cabotage trade, so for example, feeding coastal areas within a particular country, you're at sea for quite a short period of time. Contrast that with ocean-going sea freight, and then you're at sea for a number of months at a time, and then contrast that again with industrial fishers, for example, tuna longliners, where you're at sea for sometimes 2 years at a time. And the working conditions on these boats are, of course, massively differentiated, and we don't want to go into this here. But what we do see is the incredible squeeze on workers' time, seafarers' time, whether they're fishers or fishing crew or crew on boats. And one of the areas where we see that squeeze is in leisure time. And so the space that people have for their day-to-day lives is ever shorter and, perhaps most importantly, increasingly isolated. So the field of maritime psychology has kind of emerged to try to deal with the strains and the stresses that come with working at sea, the extreme forms of alienation that come with that. And similarly, it's the problem of understanding these processes is that they are entirely contingent. Each boat is a different workplace, and each boat has a different captain. And historically, the captain has been sovereign of boats at sea, and that is still the case now, although onshore transnational boat management companies now dominate the way that shipping is organized. The captain still plays a major role. So whether or not you're able to gain access to email to kind of contact your family or friends or whatever is very often a whim of the captain. And so the leisure time that is available for people's lives, working lives at sea, is very often squeezed and at someone's whim. Even when onshore, the leisure time that is available is squeezed by the speed up of turnaround time in ports and the new logistical spaces that capital has created outside of cities because of land rents. You know, the classic kind of example of that season of The Wire, who's ever watched The Wire, where you see very, a significant investment in, fancy apartments, which we see all in cities all over the world, and as a result, ports being pushed further outside of cities, which make them even less of a humane place for crew to be living in when they're on shore. So what this all kind of connects to, I suppose, is an altogether not especially optimistic view about the role of logistics choke points. There's a big literature on this, and there's some quite hopeful, we would argue perhaps overly optimistic analyses that see that logistics choke points can be articulated by logistics workers in ports and on boats to try to realize increased gains or capture more gains from those industries. But we see them as entirely conjunctural, and we don't see any a special specificity actually from that. But finally, we do want to return just briefly to the question of deep time. So what we would like to argue as a kind of closing, and then Alex may wish to add more, is another notion of time, which is revolutionary time. And what we want to make, the point we want to make here is, hang on just 1 second, there we go, is a little bit different. So if we are seeing sea surface temperature getting hotter, as this image shows, unfortunately it's in Fahrenheit, but it's quite useful recent data produced by NOAA, who's one of the major science providers of these data. What we see is two things. First of all, that we need to look both at sea surface temperature and climate temperature as kind of being in an Earth system kind of relationship, which is very often ignored. But the second thing that we want to kind of argue is that even if we were to reach the Paris Accord on a 1.5 degrees Celsius kind of limit for climate change by 2100, sea temperatures will continue to rise, and they will continue to rise well above 2 degrees Celsius. Now, the impacts of that are unknowable. Scientists call it a non-analog kind of situation. Tipping points that will be spurred on by this are unknowable, including, for example, the impacts on the Gulf Stream. And one of the interesting things about this figure is that you can see everywhere's getting hotter, except for one location, which of course is around the Arctic ice sheets, where it's getting cooler, obviously because the ice is being melted. So what we want to use this to think about is the notion of revolutionary time, because baked into our system as a civilization, into the sea, is this heating, and this heating will be with us for generations to come, whether we like it or not. Now, the idea of revolutionary time very often in kind of political philosophy refers to, key moments like 1789 in France or 1917 in Russia, and what it refers to is very rapid periods of socio-political change of the kind that really sees speed up, incredible speed up, that results in new institutions that we wouldn't expect to have seen before that revolutionary event happened. Now, as I think we've made clear, we don't see any significant revolutionary potential of seafarers and choke points, although they may well become important agents in shifts in anything like a kind of progressive response to capitalism. But we do think that the Earth system itself is shifting, and its planetary shifts itself will produce revolutionary change, the climate and the ocean and their interactions. And so the socio-institutional changes that will become apparent from this socio-ecological revolution are anyone's guess. But it does seem more likely than not that the forms of global civilizational connections that have been made possible by the articulation of capitalism in the sea, will no longer exist. And so kind of a little bit of a pessimistic conclusion, but when we started thinking about time in this way, it threw these up. Over to you, Alex.
I think I'm going to leave it with the pessimism of the intellect, and let's see if we get elsewhere with the Q&A.